Welcome. In this lesson, we are going to start our unit on two-dimensional arrays. So let's get started. We've got two learning goals for today. The first is that you need to be able to create 2D arrays in Java using a specified number of rows and columns. And the second thing is that we want to be able to access and modify the elements of a 2D array using index values. Now, even if you remember some things about two-dimensional arrays from a previous programming course, I would encourage you to really tune into this lesson because I promise that you're going to see some stuff that's new and that's really important. Before we dive into the idea of a two-dimensional array, let's briefly recall what we've already learned about arrays from a previous unit. So we learned that we can actually store a list of values in a single variable, and that's called an array. And we learned a couple of ways to do that. The example on top shows that we create an array that will hold 10 integers. And on the bottom, we have an example that's doing a very similar thing, except using an initializer list where we can specify the exact values we want the array to hold. And of course, we did this because it was really convenient, right? If we have a lot of information to store, making 10 separate variables is a lot more work than making one variable that can hold 10 elements. But it turns out that if I have a lot of data, using a regular array or arrays might not even be enough. Let's take a look at the example on the right. So this represents a grade book of students. And so let's pretend that I have 30 students. You can see them student 1, 2, 3, all the way to 30. And each student, we're going to keep track of 4 exam grades. And so we can see that, for example, student 1 has scored 98, 83, 92, and 79. And basically my code needs to keep track and hold all of those scores. So using arrays like I've done here is helpful, right? Because if I have 30 students and 4 grades apiece, 30 times 4 is 120 individual variables that I would have to make if I didn't have arrays at all. In this case, I've cut it down to 30 variables, 30 arrays that store 4 values, but 30 is still a lot, so I'd like to do even better if I can. Fortunately, I can do better. I can actually take all of this data, 120 values, 30 students times 4 grades, and store them all in a single variable because of a thing called two-dimensional arrays. So let's take a look at what that is next. This code that you see on the screen is exactly what I would need to make an array so that I could store all the grades for my students in one variable called gradebook. You'll notice on the left side that I have 2 sets of brackets, one bracket for each dimension of the array. And then on the right side, I also have 2 sets of brackets. The first one specifies how many rows I want in my array, and I want 30 rows to represent the 30 students. And then the second number, the second dimension, represents the number of columns, or in this case, I'm saying I want each of my 30 students to have 4 grades. Here we can see a visual of what the code on the previous slide creates. So when we make our new gradebook, notice we're making a new array of integers. And we're saying first that we want it to have 30 rows. And rows go across, left to right. So at the top we have row 0, then we have row 1 going across all the way to the bottom when we have row 29. And of course, if I start at 0 and count to 29, that gives me 30 total rows. We also have the 4 columns, starting with column 0 on the left. Columns go up and down, column 1, column 2, and column 3 for a total of 4 columns. If you remember arrays before, you probably remember using index values to access elements. And of course, that's no different with a two-dimensional array other than the fact that there's 2 indexes for the 2 dimensions. So in my sample code here, I want to set the 4th student's 3rd exam score to 93. And so here's how I do it. The first thing I do is I say go to gradebook at row 3. The row always comes first. And so row 3 is right here. And this represents all of these students' grades. But I don't want to look at all the grades. I specifically want to go to column 2, which would be their 3rd exam score. So I'm going to row 3 and column 2, and that means that we're going to put a 93 in that spot, the 4th student's 3rd exam. And in this way, I can access any element in my 2D array. I just need to use the 2 dimensions, the row and the column. Row always comes first. All right, now that we have a little bit of an idea about how 2D arrays work, let's pull back the curtain a little bit and look behind the scenes to see what's going on. So it turns out that in Java, 2D arrays aren't really a thing, at least not a thing in the sense of the picture that I've already showed you. There's a little bit more going on there. And it turns out that a two-dimensional array is actually just an array of arrays. Now, that can confuse even the smartest person really quickly. So we're going to try to unpack that over the next couple slides and see what's going on. But long story short, this is what's happening. When you make a 2D array, you're actually creating one array, but then every spot in that array is another array. It's an array of arrays. If we apply that idea to the gradebook that we've been working with, and we take a look at our dimensions, is starting with the 30, right? So that's the number of rows in the array, but what it's really saying is to make an array that holds 30 elements. And then the second dimension, the 4, we know that as the number of columns, but it's really saying make an array of size 4. So what I'm really getting is 30 arrays of size 4. A two-dimensional array is an array of arrays. So each element of the first array, this one, is another array. Let's look at this from a slightly different angle. So let's say I wanted to access all of the grades for the second student. Well, I could do that like this. I could say, give me gradebook 1. And notice I've only put one dimension there. And by saying gradebook 1, I'm saying I want to talk about the entire array that is stored at index 1. Now, if I wanted to get more specific, then I could do something like this, where I would say, go to gradebook at row 1, look at the whole thing, but I only want to access element 0 of that array, or the 72. So my intent with this slide was to help you see the two dimensions sort of separately, if that makes sense. Like I can just use one dimension and I can access the entire row, or I can also use the second dimension to access a specific element of that row. Before we wrap things up, I just wanted to mention one last thing, and that is the fact that we can actually create two-dimensional arrays with initializer lists. Now, we did this before in our unit on one-dimensional arrays, but it works here too. It can get a little complicated because there's a lot of stuff going on here, so I tried to format this in a way that it would make it pretty readable. But notice here at the beginning, I'm saying I want to create a two-dimensional int array called gradebook, and I'm going to assign it. And in my assignment, I have a big set of curly brackets that are yellow here, one at the beginning, one at the end. And then notice that each element of my array is another array. So the first element of gradebook should be this array with 98, 83, 92, and 79. And the second element should be this and so on and so forth. So gradebook contains 4 elements, and each element is itself another array. And so maybe this also helps you with the visualization and the idea of a two-dimensional array just being an array of arrays. Time for an understanding check. And this understanding check is really geared, again, back toward that abstract idea of a two-dimensional array being an array of arrays. So I've got my gradebook created with my initializer list, and then I have some code below that print lines a value at the end. And I just want to know what value gets print lined. So pause the video, and when you're ready, restart, and we'll chat about the answer. So after I make the gradebook array at the beginning, the first thing I do is I make a new array called grades. Notice this is a single dimensional array, and I assign it to gradebook 3. Well, gradebook 3, I mean, this means row 3. So 0, 1, 2, 3. We're talking about the last row of the gradebook. And I'm talking about the entire row, which is an array, right? So grades, which is an array, will store the values of the last row, 75, 80, 93, and 87. And then the next line of code makes a new int variable called score and assigns it to grades 2. Well, here's the grades array, and grades 0, 1, 2 is 93, so score will store a 93, which is of course what gets print lined at the end. All right, now that we've done this lesson, you should be able to create and use 2D arrays in Java with a specified number of rows and columns, and then also be able to access and modify elements of a 2D array using index values. And of course, sort of underpinning both of those objectives is the idea that a two-dimensional array is really just an array of arrays.